Hello and welcome to Mysteries of Science. My name's Kieran and I'm the features editor of Science+Nature, the monthly magazine from the people who make The Week Junior.
And I'm Stevie, I'm the assistant editor. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. In each episode we look at a different mysterious topic and try to solve it. So Kieran, what are we investigating today?
I am really looking forward to this one. It is one of the most famous historic landmarks in Britain, possibly even the world, and it has been around for more than 4,000 years. And yet, secrets remain. We still don't know everything there is to know about it. So we're going to be looking at Stonehenge, which is that famous stone circle in Wiltshire in England.
This is the perfect time to start an investigation into Stonehenge as well, because on the 21st of December it will be the winter solstice, or the day of the year with the fewest hours of daylight. Stonehenge, as we'll discover later on, has a very clear connection to this date.
Yeah, and while you might think you know all there is to know about Stonehenge, that it's prehistoric, that it's a ring of standing stones, there are so many mysteries that remain.
So to start with, I'd like to find out when Stonehenge was made, who made it, how they made it, and ultimately, why.
I like it. I like the questions. When, who, how, and why. Let's get to it. This is the story of Stonehenge, and this is Mysteries of Science.
Stonehenge itself is a stone circle, but it's a very special stone circle.
This is Nick, an archaeologist at Stonehenge who works for the National Trust.
It's surrounded by hundreds of other burial mounds and ancient monuments, temples, shrines that were built thousands of years ago. So it's the centre of really this big religious complex. And Stonehenge itself, if I describe to you what Stonehenge looks like, if you were to fly over it, imagine you're a bird flying over the top of Stonehenge, and you look down, what you would see is a circle made up of stone, and within that circle is a big horseshoe made up of stone. And what you're seeing there are the tops of an arrangement of stones. That's what makes Stonehenge so very different from every other stone circle. Because if you stood on the ground and looked at it, what you would see is there are a whole series of stones that stand upright, and there are pairs of these stones, and across the top of them, a bit like a door frame, if you imagine you're standing in front of a door frame, is another stone that stretches right across the top. And it's that joining up of the circle and the horseshoe, of that connecting bit at the top that you see from above. So it's actually quite a complicated structure.
These groupings of three stones, two upright and one on its side that connects the other two, are called trilithons. Those horizontal stones are called lintels, and they are a unique feature for Stonehenge. No other stone circles have them.
Yeah, and it's those trilithons that are one of the reasons why Stonehenge is so famous, but there is something else that makes Stonehenge stand out from the crowd too.
It's also unique because the stones have been worked and shaped by prehistoric people. So each of the stones that you see when you look at a picture of Stonehenge has been sort of bashed away at using hammer stones and shaped into joints. So it's a bit like a big Lego set. And again, that's a completely unique quality. So Stonehenge is a very unusual stone circle and a very special one.
So as you know, if you've picked up the latest copy of Science+Nature, the use of such tools takes us all the way back to the Stone Age.
Yeah, and I think this might help us to answer our first question. When was Stonehenge made?
So the stones are put up at Stonehenge in 2500 BC. So that's about 4,500 years ago. And this is a period that we call the late Neolithic. So the very end of the Stone Age, in effect. It's just before people start to use the earliest metals in Britain. And this is a time, as I said, when people are farming. They have been farming for about 1,000 years, so they're very experienced farmers. They have got domestic crops, but the main sort of economic thing at the time seems to have been herding cattle. So cattle used for dairy products, used for meat. probably also for traction and transport. And people would have perhaps led relatively mobile lives. So we don't have that many settlements from this period. We can't point to where everybody was living. But in general terms, all we find are the pits where people have buried their food remains and their broken pottery and things. So evidence for housing and where people are living is quite rare. And we think, therefore, that people were probably living sort of seasonal or moving around quite a lot with their herds of cattle and pigs and things. So it's quite difficult for us to imagine what life was like, but they would have definitely come together at certain times of the year and for certain building projects like Stonehenge.
So question 1 answered. Stonehenge dates back 4,500 years. It has changed a bit over the years, but that's when the construction began.
Yeah, and we also know a little bit about the people who made it. So farmers who probably wandered around the country depending on the time of year.
So that seems pretty straightforward so far. So now we'll get into the central parts of the mystery. How on earth do you even begin to make such a huge structure like Stonehenge?
It's crazy. And, let's be completely clear. If you've not been to Stonehenge before, it is big. Each of those stones weighs around 30 tons. And I've done some quick maths on this. And that's the equivalent of 4.5 fully grown adult male African elephants. So that's a lot of stuff to be carrying around. And I don't know about you, Stevie, but I can't imagine lifting even one of those stones, even if I had all of my friends with me.
Okay, so let's think about this. Maybe the stones were already there, so they just needed to be propped up in a circle shape?
See, I did wonder that, but actually it turns out that recent research in the past couple of years has revealed precisely where these stones came from. And it's not where Stonehenge is. So here's Susan again with a story that takes us all the way to the US and back again.
Yeah, that's right. So we had a phone call a few years ago from somebody saying, well, I've got a piece of Stonehenge and we think you should have it back, which was a bit of a surprise to us. And it turned out that in the late 1950s, when some restoration work had happened, and one of the trilithons, which is a name we give to 3 stones, 2 uprights and a horizontal one, when that was set upright in 1958, it had actually been pinned together with some metal bars because there was a big crack through it. And when that work was done, a core, so a long cylinder of stone, had been extracted from that particular standing stone. And the guy that had done that work, he worked for a diamond cutting company, so he was a specialist cutter of stone, had kept the core and taken it back and mounted it on his wall. And basically when he retired to America, took it with him. And now he was very elderly and he was sort of clearing out his belongings and decided that we ought to have this core of stone back.
Cheeky.
As it happens, a geologist, so someone who studies stones, at the University of Brighton called David Nash, was desperate to find some of the sarsen stone, so that's the big stones at Stonehenge, because he wanted to do some destructive research on it, which sounds like a lot of fun. And that's basically where your study involves destroying or damaging the thing that you're looking at. And this research would allow him to compare the stones to others that are around the country and find out where they had come from. But all his requests had been denied because the stones are protected, you don't want to damage them. But then he was allowed to use this newly found core that had been in the US.
His research then compared that stone with other samples taken from natural sarsens that are found all across different bits of southern England. And the closest match was to an area called West Woods, which is just near the town of Marlborough, about 15 miles to the north of Stonehenge. And that was the closest geology match. And we'd always thought that the sarsens probably came from the Marlborough Downs, which is this area to the north, but we had never known exactly which site. And so this has managed to pinpoint exactly the area that the sarsen stones were brought from for the first time.
Wow, so this little bit of stone found in America helped researchers discover where the stones in Stonehenge came from. That's absolutely crazy.
It is crazy, and just as well that bloke kept his little bit of rock that he'd been working on. And also by discovering where the stones came from, it helps you to picture a little bit how people might have got them to the site of Stonehenge.
This is a time before wheels, before any kind of transportation. So these stones must have just been dragged using probably just human power. Probably putting them onto sledges and dragging them. Various different routes have been proposed over the sort of 15 miles or so.
So we know the how, the when, and the who, but my big question, why Stonehenge was built, still remains.
Yeah, and I think this is the best question because there isn't one obvious answer, and that's the sort of question we like on Mysteries of Science. And the reason that we don't know why Stonehenge was built necessarily was because people at that time didn't write down what they were up to or what they were using certain monuments for. However, it seems almost certain that Stonehenge had something to do with the sun. So back to you, Nick.
The really important thing about Stonehenge itself in relation to rituals is that it lines up in a particular direction. And it's aligned on what we call the solstices.
So just to add, there are 2 solstices a year. The winter solstice, which will be 21st of December this year, is the day with the fewest daylight hours of the year. The summer solstice, which will be 21st of June 2022, is the day with the most daylight hours of the year. And if you're listening to this from the southern hemisphere, that's any country beneath the invisible line that runs around the centre of the globe, then your solstices are switched, with the winter solstice coming in June and summer solstice in December.
So quite famously, if you go to Stonehenge at what's known as midsummer solstice, that's on the longest day, and you stand in the middle of the stone circle and look out through the gap in the horseshoe, you look down onto another monument actually, which is known as the Avenue. And the Avenue is an amazing thing in itself. It's a double set of what were originally a big set of banks. You'd have looked on either side of you and seen banks standing about 1.5 metres high with ditches on the outside that formed a processional walkway that ran for 1.75 miles all the way down to the River Avon. But the important thing about the Avenue when you look out onto it is that Stonehenge and the Avenue are aligned on the solstice. So if you stand there at midsummer sunrise, you would see the sun rising in front of you in line with the gap in the stones and the Avenue. But if you turn round and instead, if you imagine you're there at midwinter solstice when the days are at their shortest, so just before Christmas time, if you stand there at the end of the day and you watch the sun sinking, you would see it sinking in the other direction, right through the gap that sits in the middle of what we call the Great Trilithon. So that's the big door frame, if you like, that sits at the back of the stone circle, and you'd stand there and watch the setting sun falling absolutely bang smack in front of you. I think it tells us a few things. I think it tells us that the people who built it were, well, for a start, they were really observant, because they would have had to have, understood, if you like, the turning of the year when the sun rises and falls, because of course the sun moves in the position where it rises and falls every day of the year. So they would have had to stand there, observe it and mark it out. And it also tells us that those times of year, I think we particularly think now midwinter, and I'll explain why in a second, but midwinter itself is a really dangerous time, or at least it was for the people who built this place.
That's right. Remember, back in the Stone Age, there was no central heating, there were no insulated homes to keep you cosy, ovens to cook you some hot food at night. Winter was a really rough time. And with less food about, people would have been struggling. So here's Susan again.
Actually, archaeologists think that potentially the midwinter was more important. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that when you come into Stonehenge through the main entrance, so through the main opening into the enclosure and up the avenue, you're looking ahead towards the midwinter sunset. So if you think about going into a church or some other important building, you wouldn't normally go in and then turn around to see the main event. You would go in and the main event would be ahead of you. So that's thinking that maybe the midwinter solstice was more important. And we don't know why winter solstice was important. It may have been significant to mark the returning sun, to conduct ceremonies to ensure that the year continued to turn and the sun came back. If you imagine that these people are farmers, everything about their daily lives would be reliant on the warmth of the sun, the return of the spring. That would have been really significant for them in the agricultural year to make sure that the sun came back and make sure that the world kept turning. So perhaps it's really central to their religious beliefs that they build the monument and come and celebrate particular ceremonies and rituals at that time of year.
Brilliant. So the people who built Stonehenge were clearly aware of how the sun moved through the sky at different times of the year, and they wanted to celebrate or honour these days when this was at its most extreme.
Yeah, definitely. And in the middle of winter, who can blame them for doing all that they could to encourage the return of spring? I actually looked this morning, just before we started to record this, and there was a news story about the fact that there is evidence that they had possibly mince pie-like snacks while they were at Stonehenge, and there is definitely evidence that they would create a huge feast of pork as well to coincide with the midwinter. So there was probably a big feast as part of that ceremony.
That's really fascinating. Right, so have we got the when, the who, the how, and the why?
Yeah, I think we've sort of done it. There's sort of a question mark maybe remaining about the why. We know it's something to do with the solstice, but maybe not the specifics. You know, I'd really love to know more about the reasons behind Stonehenge, just because it was such a big job to make this stone circle. You must really want that stone circle to exist if you're willing to put in all of that effort to drag those stones from miles and miles.
Well, I find the best mysteries always have questions unanswered, but I wonder what our experts think. Nick, are there any other mysteries remaining?
So I would say, if you imagine that everything we could know about Stonehenge, so everything that's ever happened there in the past and why it's happened, is 1 hour on a clock, I would say we probably know about 10 seconds worth. So not very much. But we have probably learnt in the course of the last 10 or 20 years maybe about 5 seconds worth of that. So our knowledge, I think, has speeded up enormously, partly because of new techniques we can use.
Okay, so we've got 23 hours, 59 minutes and 50 seconds still to go. It sounds like we've maybe not fully cracked the case of Stonehenge.
Yeah, it sounds that way. So I have a question for everyone listening to this podcast. What secrets do you hope Stonehenge will reveal in the future? What would you like to know about your Stone Age ancestors? How do you think people figured out when the shortest day of the year was? Get in touch.
Yeah, there's lots of ways you can contact us. So you can email us on hello@science-nature.co.uk, or you can leave a comment as a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this podcast right now.
And if you need to get your hands on even more mysteries, make sure you pick up a copy of the latest Science and Nature.
That's right, we'll be back in a fortnight's time with a new episode looking back over the best mysteries of 2021 with unheard clips, exclusives and more. And then in the new year, we've got new mysteries for you to enjoy, including episodes all about aliens and the multiverse.
Oh, but until the next time, stay curious.
If you want to get your hands on a copy of the Week Junior magazine, we're offering a 6-week free trial. To get yours, head over to dennismags.co.uk/The Week Junior and use the code PODCAST.